A collection of fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm. Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a dear little girl who was loved by everyone who looked at her, but most of all by her grandmother, and there was nothing that she would not have given to the child. Once, she gave her a little cape of red velvet, which suited her so well that she would never wear anything else. So she was always called Little Red Riding Hood. One day, her mother said to her, "Come, Little Red Riding Hood. Here is a piece of cake and a bottle of wine. Take them to your grandmother. She is ill and weak, and they will do her good. Set out before it gets hot, and when you are going, walk nicely and quietly, and do not run off the path, or you may fall and break the bottle, and then your grandmother will get nothing. And when you go into her room, don't forget to say, 'Good morning,' and don't peep into every corner before you do it." "I will take great care," said Little Red Riding Hood to her mother, and gave her hand on it. The grandmother lived out in the wood, half a league from the village, and just as Little Red Riding Hood entered the wood, a wolf met her. Red Riding Hood did not know what a wicked creature he was, and was not at all afraid of him. "Good day, Little Red Riding Hood," said he. "Thank you, kindly wolf." "Whither away so early, Little Red Riding Hood?" "To my grandmother's." "What have you got in your apron?" "Cake and wine. Yesterday was baking day, so poor sick grandmother is to have something good to make her stronger." "Where does your grandmother live, Little Red Riding Hood?" "A good quarter of a league farther on in the wood. Her house stands under the 3 large oak trees. The nut trees are just below. You surely must know it," replied Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf thought to himself, "What a tender young creature! What a nice, plump mouthful! She will be better to eat than the old woman. I must act craftily, so as to catch both." So he walked for a short time by the side of Little Red Riding Hood, and then he said, "See, Little Red Riding Hood, how pretty the flowers are about here. Why do you not look round? I believe, too, that you do not hear how sweetly the little birds are singing. You walk gravely along as if you were going to school, while everything else out here in the wood is merry." Little Red Riding Hood raised her eyes, and when she saw the sunbeams dancing here and there through the trees, and pretty flowers growing everywhere, she thought, "Suppose I take grandmother a fresh nosegay. That would please her too. It is so early in the day that I shall still get there in good time." And so she ran from the path into the wood to look for flowers, and whenever she had picked one, she fancied that she saw a still prettier one farther on, and ran after it, and so got deeper and deeper into the wood. Meanwhile, the wolf ran straight to the grandmother's house and knocked at the door. "Who is there?" "Little Redcap," replied the wolf. "She is bringing cake and wine. Open the door." "Lift the latch," called out the grandmother. "I am too weak and cannot get up." The wolf lifted the latch. The door flew open, and without saying a word, he went straight to the grandmother's bed and devoured her. Then he put on her clothes, dressed himself in her cap, laid himself in bed, and drew the curtains. Little Red Riding Hood, however, had been running about picking flowers, and when she had gathered so many that she could carry no more, she remembered her grandmother and set out on the way to her. She was surprised to find the cottage door standing open, and when she went into the room, she had such a strange feeling that she said to herself, "Oh dear, how uneasy I feel today, and at other times I like being with grandmother so much." She called out, "Good morning," but received no answer. So she went to the bed and drew back the curtains. There lay her grandmother, with her cap pulled far over her face and looking very strange. "Oh, grandmother," she said, "what big ears you have." "The better to hear you with, my child," was the reply. "But grandmother, what big eyes you have," she said. "The better to see you with, my dear." "But grandmother, what large hands you have." "The better to hug you with." "Oh, but grandmother, what a terrible big mouth you have." "The better to eat you with." And scarcely had the wolf said this than with one bound he was out of bed and swallowed up Red Riding Hood. When the wolf had appeased his appetite, he lay down again in the bed, fell asleep, and began to snore very loud. The huntsman was just passing the house and thought to himself, "How the old woman is snoring! I must just see if she wants anything." So he went into the room, and when he came to the bed, he saw that the wolf was lying in it. "Do I find thee here, thou old sinner?" said he. "I have long sought thee." Then, just as he was going to fire at him, it occurred to him that the wolf might have devoured the grandmother, and that she might still be saved. So he did not fire, but took a pair of scissors and began to cut open the stomach of the sleeping wolf. When he had made 2 snips, he saw the little red hood shining, and then he made 2 snips more, and the little girl sprang out, crying, "Ah, how frightened I have been! How dark it was inside the wolf!" And after that, the aged grandmother came out alive also, but scarcely able to breathe. Red Riding Hood, however, quickly fetched great stones with which they filled the wolf's body, and when he awoke, he wanted to run away, but the stones were so heavy that he fell down at once and fell dead. Then all 3 were delighted. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Red Riding Hood had brought and revived. But Red Riding Hood thought to herself, "As long as I live, I will never by myself leave the path to run into the wood when my mother has forbidden me to do so." Hansel and Gretel. Hard by a great forest dwelt a poor woodcutter with his wife and his 2 children. The boy was called Hansel, and the girl Gretel. He had little to bite and to break, and once, when great scarcity fell on the land, he could no longer procure daily bread. Now, when he thought over this by night in his bed and tossed about in his anxiety, he groaned and said to his wife, "What is to become of us? How are we to feed our poor children when we no longer have anything even for ourselves?" "I'll tell you what, husband," answered the woman. "Early tomorrow morning we will take the children out into the forest to where it is the thickest. There we will light a fire for them and give each of them 1 piece of bread more, and then we will go to our work and leave them alone. They will not find the way home again, and we shall be rid of them." "No, wife," said the man. "I will not do that. How can I bear to leave my children alone in the forest? The wild animals would soon come and tear them to pieces." "Oh, thou fool," said she. "Then we must all four die of hunger. Thou mayest as well plane the planks for our coffins." And she left him no peace until he consented. "But I feel very sorry for the poor children all the same," said the man. The two children had also not been able to sleep for hunger and had heard what their stepmother had said to their father. Gretel wept bitter tears and said to Hansel, "Now all is over with us." "Be quiet, Gretel," said Hansel. "Do not distress thyself. I will soon find a way to help us." And when the old folks had fallen asleep, he got up, put on his little coat, opened the door below, and crept outside. The moon shone brightly, and the white pebbles which lay in front of the house glittered like real silver pennies. Hansel stooped and put as many of them in the little pocket of his coat as he could possibly get in. Then he went back and said to Gretel, "Be comforted, dear little sister, and sleep in peace. God will not forsake us." And he lay down again in his bed. When day dawned, but before the sun had risen, the woman came and awoke the two children, saying, "Get up, you sluggards. We are going into the forest to fetch wood." She gave each a little piece of bread and said, "There is something for your dinner, but do not eat it up before then, for you will get nothing else." Gretel took the bread under her apron, as Hansel had the stones in his pocket. Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. When they had walked a short time, Hansel stood still and peeped back at the house, and did so again and again. His father said, "Hansel, what art thou looking at there and staying behind for? Mind what thou art about, and do not forget how to use thy legs." "Oh, father," said Hansel, "I'm looking at my little white cat, which is sitting up on the roof and wants to say goodbye to me." The wife said, "Fool, that is not thy little cat. That is the morning sun which is shining on the chimneys." Hansel, however, had not been looking back at the cat, but had been constantly throwing one of the white pebble stones out of his pocket on the road. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now, children, pile up some wood, and I will light a fire, that you may not be cold." Hansel and Gretel gathered brushwood together as high as a little hill. The brushwood was lighted, and when the flames were burning very high, the woman said, "Now, children, lay yourselves down by the fire and rest. We will go into the forest and cut some wood. When we have done, we will come back and fetch you away." Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and when noon came, each ate a little piece of bread, and as they heard the strokes of the wood axe, they believed that their father was near. It was not, however, the axe. It was a branch which he had fastened to a withered tree which the wind was blowing backwards and forwards. And as they had been sitting such a long time, their eyes shut with fatigue, and they fell fast asleep. When at last they awoke, it was already dark night. Gretel began to cry and said, "How are we to get out of the forest now?" But Hansel comforted her and said, "Just wait a little until the moon has risen, and then we will soon find the way." And when the full moon had risen, Hansel took his little sister by the hand and followed the pebbles which shone like newly coined silver pieces and showed them the way. They walked the whole night long, and by break of day came once more to their father's house. They knocked at the door, and when the woman opened it and saw that it was Hansel and Gretel, she said, "You naughty children! Why have you slept so long in the forest? We thought you were never coming back at all." The father, however, rejoiced, for it had cut him to the heart to leave them behind alone. Not long afterwards, there was once more great scarcity in all parts, and the children heard their mother saying at night to their father, "Everything is eaten again. We have 1/2 loaf left, and after that there is an end. The children must go. We will take them farther into the wood, so that they will not find their way out again. There is no other means of saving ourselves." The man's heart was heavy, and he thought, "It would be better for thee to share the last mouthful with thy children." The woman, however, would listen to nothing that he had to say, but scolded and reproached him. He who says A must say B likewise, and as he had yielded the first time, he had to do so a second time also. The children were, however, still awake and had heard the conversation. When the old folks were asleep, Hansel again got up and wanted to go out and pick up pebbles as he had done before. But the woman had locked the door, and Hansel could not get out. Nevertheless, he comforted his little sister and said, "Do not cry, Gretel. Go to sleep quietly. The good God will help us." Early in the morning came the woman and took the children out of their beds. Their bit of bread was given to them, but it was still smaller than the time before. On the way into the forest, Hansel crumbled his in his pocket and often stood still and threw a morsel on the ground. "Hansel, why dost thou stop and look round?" said the father. "Go on." "I am looking back at my little pigeon, which is sitting on the roof and wants to say goodbye to me," answered Hansel. "Simpleton," said the woman. "That is not thy little pigeon, that is the morning sun that is shining on the chimney." Hansel, however, little by little, threw all the crumbs on the path. The woman led the children still deeper into the forest, where they had never in their lives been before. Then a great fire was again made, and the mother said, "Just sit there, you children, and when you are tired you may sleep a little. We are going into the forest to cut wood, and in the evening when we are done, we will come and fetch you away." When it was noon, Gretel shared her piece of bread with Hansel, who had scattered his by the way. Then they fell asleep, and evening came and went, but no one came to the poor children. They did not awake until it was dark night, and Hansel comforted his little sister and said, "Just wait, Gretel, until the moon rises, and then we shall see the crumbs of bread which I have strewn about. They will show us our way home again." When the moon came, they set out, but they found no crumbs, for the many thousands of birds which fly about in the woods and fields had picked them all up. Hansel said to Gretel, "We shall soon find the way." But they did not find it. They walked the whole night and all the next day too, from morning till evening, but they did not get out of the forest and were very hungry, for they had nothing to eat but 2 or 3 berries which grew on the ground. And as they were so weary that their legs would carry them no longer, they lay down beneath a tree and fell asleep. It was now 3 mornings since they had left their father's house. They began to walk again, but they always got deeper into the forest, and if help did not come soon, they must die of hunger and weariness. When it was midday, they saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a bough, which sang so delightfully that they stood still and listened to it. And when it had finished its song, it spread its wings and flew away before them, and they followed it until they reached a little house, on the roof of which it alighted. And when they came quite up to the little house, they saw that it was built of bread and covered with cakes, but that the windows were of clear sugar. "We will set to work on that," said Hansel, "and have a good meal. I will eat a bit of the roof, and thou, Gretel, canst eat some of the window. It will taste sweet." Hansel reached up above and broke off a little of the roof to try how it tasted, and Gretel leant against the window and nibbled at the panes. Then a soft voice cried from the room, "Nibble, nibble, gnaw. Who is nibbling at my little house?" The children answered, "The wind, the wind, the heaven-born wind," and went on eating without disturbing themselves. Hansel, who thought the roof tasted very nice, tore down a great piece of it, and Gretel pushed out the whole of one round window pane, sat down, and enjoyed herself with it. Suddenly, the door opened, and a very, very old woman, who supported herself on crutches, came creeping out. Hansel and Gretel were so terribly frightened that they let fall what they had in their hands. The old woman, however, nodded her head and said, "Oh, you dear children, who has brought you here? Do come in and stay with me. No harm shall happen to you." She took them both by the hand and led them into her little house. Then good food was set before them, milk and pancakes, with sugar, apples and nuts. Afterwards, 2 pretty little beds were covered with clean white linen, and Hansel and Gretel lay down in them and thought they were in heaven. The old woman had only pretended to be so kind. She was, in reality, a wicked witch who lay in wait for children and had only built the little house of bread in order to entice them there. When a child fell into her power, she killed it, cooked, and ate it. And that was a feast day for her. Witches have red eyes and cannot see far, but they have a keen scent like the beasts and are aware when human beings draw near. When Hansel and Gretel came into her neighborhood, she laughed maliciously and said mockingly, "I have them. They shall not escape me again." Early in the morning, before the children were awake, she was already up, and when she saw both of them sleeping and looking so pretty with their plump red cheeks, she muttered to herself, "That will be a dainty mouthful." Then she seized Hansel with her shriveled hand, carried him into a little stable, and shut him in with a grated door. He might scream as he liked, that was of no use. Then she went to Gretel, shook her till she awoke, and cried, "Get up, lazy thing! Fetch some water, and cook something good for thy brother. He is in the stable outside, and is to be made fat. When he is fat, I will eat him." Gretel began to weep bitterly, but it was all in vain. She was forced to do what the wicked witch ordered her. And now the best food was cooked for poor Hansel, but Gretel got nothing but crab shells. Every morning the woman crept to the little stable and cried, "Hansel, stretch out thy finger, that I may feel if thou wilt soon be fat." Hansel, however, stretched out a little bone to her, and the old woman, who had dim eyes, could not see it, and thought it was Hansel's finger, and was astonished that there was no way of fattening him. When 4 weeks had gone by, and Hansel still continued thin, she was seized with impatience, and would not wait any longer. "Holla, Gretel," she cried to the girl. "Be active and bring some water. Let Hansel be fat or lean. Tomorrow I will kill him and cook him." Oh, how the poor little sister did lament when she had to fetch the water, and how her tears did flow down over her cheeks. "Dear God, do help us," she cried. "If the wild beasts in the forest had but devoured us, we should at any rate have died together." "Just keep thy noise to thyself," said the old woman. "All that won't help thee at all." Early in the morning, Gretel had to go out and hang up the cauldron with the water and light the fire. "We will bake first," said the old woman. "I've already heated the oven and kneaded the dough." She pushed poor Gretel out to the oven, from which flames of fire were already darting. "Creep in," said the witch, "and see if it is properly heated so that we can shut the bread in." And when once Gretel was inside, she intended to shut the oven and let her bake in it, and then she would eat her too. But Gretel saw what she had in her mind and said, "I do not know how I am to do it. How do you get in?" "Silly goose," said the old woman. "The door is big enough. Just look, I can get in myself." And she crept up and thrust her head into the oven. Then Gretel gave her a push that drove her far into it and shut the iron door and fastened the bolt. Oh, then she began to howl quite horribly, but Gretel ran away, and the godless witch was miserably burnt to death. Gretel, however, ran like lightning to Hansel, opened his little stable, and cried, "Hansel, we are saved! The old witch is dead!" Then Hansel sprang out like a bird from its cage when the door is opened for it. How they did rejoice and embrace each other, and dance about and kiss each other. And as they had no longer any need to fear her, they went into the witch's house, and in every corner there stood chests full of pearls and jewels. "These are far better than pebbles," said Hansel, and thrust into his pockets whatever could be got in. And Gretel said, "I too will take something home with me," and filled her pinafore full. "But now we will go away," said Hansel, "that we may get out of the witch's forest." When they had walked for 2 hours, they came to a great piece of water. "We cannot get over," said Hansel. "I see no footplank and no bridge." "And no boat crosses either," answered Gretel. "But a white duck is swimming there. If I ask her, she will help us over." Then she cried, little duck, dost thou see? Hansel and Gretel are waiting for thee. There's never a plank or bridge in sight. Take us across on thy back so white." The duck came to them, and Hansel seated himself on its back and told his sister to sit by him. "No," replied Gretel, "that will be too heavy for the little duck. She shall take us across one after the other." The good little duck did so, and when they were once safely across and had walked for a short time, the forest seemed to be more and more familiar to them, and at length they saw from afar their father's house. Then they began to run, rushed into the parlour, and threw themselves into their father's arms. The man had not known one happy hour since he had left the children in the forest. The woman, however, was dead. Gretel emptied her pinafore until pearls and precious stones ran about the room, and Hansel threw one handful after another out of his pocket to add to them. Then all anxiety was at an end, and they lived together in perfect happiness. Cinderella. The wife of a rich man fell sick, and as she felt that her end was drawing near, she called her only daughter to her bedside and said, "Dear child, be good and pious, and then the good God will always protect thee, and I will look down on thee from heaven and be near thee." Thereupon she closed her eyes and departed. Every day the maiden went out to her mother's grave and wept, and she remained pious and good. When winter came, the snow spread a white sheet over the grave, and when the spring sun had drawn it off again, the man had taken another wife. The woman had brought 2 daughters into the house with her, who were beautiful and fair of face, but vile and black of heart. Now began a bad time for the poor stepchild. "Is the stupid goose to sit in the parlour with us?" said they. "He who wants to eat bread must earn it. Out with the kitchen wench." They took her pretty clothes away from her, put an old grey bedgown on her, and gave her wooden shoes. "Just look at the proud princess, how decked out she is," they cried and laughed, and led her into the kitchen. There she had to do hard work from morning till night, get up before daybreak, carry water, light fires, cook and wash. Besides this, the sisters did her every imaginable injury. They mocked her and emptied her peas and lentils into the ashes, so that she was forced to sit and pick them out again. In the evening, when she had worked till she was weary, she had no bed to go to, but had to sleep by the fireside in the ashes. And as on that account she always looked dusty and dirty, they called her Cinderella. It happened that the father was once going to the fair, and he asked his 2 stepdaughters what he should bring back for them. "Beautiful dresses," said one. "Pearls and jewels," said the second. "And thou, Cinderella," said he, "what wilt thou have?" "Father, break off for me the first branch which knocks against your hat on your way home." So he bought beautiful dresses, pearls and jewels for his 2 stepdaughters, and on his way home, as he was riding through a green thicket, a hazel twig brushed against him and knocked off his hat. Then he broke off the branch and took it with him. When he reached home, he gave his stepdaughters the things which they had wished for, and to Cinderella he gave the branch from the hazel bush. Cinderella thanked him, went to her mother's grave, and planted the branch on it, and wept so much that the tears fell down on it and watered it. And it grew, however, and became a handsome tree. Thrice a day, Cinderella went and sat beneath it, and wept and prayed. And a little white bird always came on the tree, and if Cinderella expressed a wish, the bird threw down to her what she had wished for. It happened, however, that the king appointed a festival which was to last 3 days, and to which all the beautiful young girls in the country were invited, in order that his son might choose himself a bride. When the 2 stepsisters heard that they too were to appear among the number, they were delighted, called Cinderella and said, "Comb our hair for us, brush our shoes and fasten our buckles, for we are going to the festival at the king's palace." Cinderella obeyed, but wept, because she too would have liked to go with them to the dance, and begged her stepmother to allow her to do so. "Thou go, Cinderella," said she. "Thou art dusty and dirty, and wouldst go to the festival. Thou hast no clothes and shoes, and yet wouldst dance." As, however, Cinderella went on asking, the stepmother at last said, "I have emptied a dish of lentils into the ashes for thee. If thou hast picked them out again in 2 hours, thou shalt go with us." The maiden went through the back door into the garden and called, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me to pick the good into the pot, the bad into the crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at last all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in and alighted amongst the ashes. And the pigeons nodded with their heads and began, "Pick, pick, pick, pick." And the rest began also, "Pick, pick, pick, pick," and gathered all the good grains into the dish. Hardly had 1 hour passed before they had finished, and all flew out again. Then the girl took the dish to her stepmother and was glad, and believed that now she would be allowed to go with them to the festival. But the stepmother said, "No, Cinderella, thou hast no clothes, and thou canst not dance. Thou wouldst only be laughed at." And as Cinderella wept at this, the stepmother said, "If thou canst pick 2 dishes of lentils out of the ashes for me in 1 hour, thou shalt go with us." And she thought to herself, "That she most certainly cannot do." When the stepmother had emptied the 2 dishes of lentils amongst the ashes, the maiden went through the back door into the garden and cried, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds under heaven, come and help me to pick the good into the pot, the bad into the crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at length all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in and alighted amongst the ashes. And the doves nodded with their heads and began, "Pick, pick, pick, pick." And the others began also, "Pick, pick, pick, pick," and gathered all the good seeds into the dishes. And before half an hour was over, they had already finished, and all flew out again. Then the maiden carried the dishes to the stepmother and was delighted, and believed that she might now go with them to the festival. But the stepmother said, "All this will not help thee. Thou goest not with us, for thou hast no clothes and canst not dance. We should be ashamed of thee." On this, she turned her back on Cinderella and hurried away with her 2 proud daughters. As no one was now at home, Cinderella went to her mother's grave beneath the hazel tree and cried, "Shiver and quiver, little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." Then the bird threw a gold and silver dress down to her, and slippers embroidered with silk and silver. She put on the dress with all speed and went to the festival. Her stepsisters and the stepmother, however, did not know her, and thought she must be a foreign princess, for she looked so beautiful in the golden dress. They never once thought of Cinderella, and believed that she was sitting at home in the dirt, picking lentils out of the ashes. The prince went to meet her, took her by the hand, and danced with her. He would dance with no other maiden, and never left loose of her hand. And if anyone else came to invite her, he said, "This is my partner." She danced till it was evening, and then she wanted to go home. But the king's son said, "I will go with thee and bear thee company," for he wished to see to whom the beautiful maiden belonged. She escaped from him, however, and sprang into the pigeon house. The king's son waited until her father came, and then he told him that the stranger maiden had leapt into the pigeon house. The old man thought, "Can it be Cinderella?" And they had to bring him an axe and a pickaxe that he might hew the pigeon house to pieces, but no one was inside it. And when they got home, Cinderella lay in her dirty clothes among the ashes, and a dim little oil lamp was burning on the mantelpiece, for Cinderella had jumped quickly down from the back of the pigeon house and had run to the little hazel tree, and there she had taken off her beautiful clothes and laid them on the grave, and the bird had taken them away again. And then she had placed herself in the kitchen amongst the ashes in her grey gown. Next day, when the festival began afresh, and her parents and the stepsisters had gone once more, Cinderella went to the hazel tree and said, "Shiver and quiver, my little tree, silver and gold throw down on me." And then the bird threw down a much more beautiful dress than on the preceding day. And when Cinderella appeared at the festival in this dress, everyone was astonished at her beauty. The king's son had waited until she came, and instantly took her by the hand and danced with no one but her. When others came and invited her, he said, "She is my partner." When evening came, she wished to leave, and the king's son followed her and wanted to see into which house she went. But she sprang away from him and into the garden behind the house. Therein stood a beautiful tall tree on which hung the most magnificent pears. She clambered so nimbly between the branches like a squirrel that the king's son did not know where she was gone. He waited until her father came and said to him, "The stranger maiden has escaped from me, and I believe she has climbed up the pear tree." The father thought, "Can it be Cinderella?" and had an axe brought and cut the tree down, but no one was on it. And when they had got into the kitchen, Cinderella lay there amongst the ashes as usual, for she had jumped down on the other side of the tree, had taken the beautiful dress to the bird on the little hazel tree, and put on her grey gown. On the third day, when the parents and sisters had gone away, Cinderella went once more to her mother's grave and said to the little tree, "Shiver and quiver, my little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." And now the bird threw down to her a dress which was more splendid and magnificent than any she had yet had, and the slippers were golden. And when she went to the festival in the dress, no one knew how to speak for astonishment. The king's son danced with her only, and if anyone invited her to dance, he said, "She is my partner." When evening came, Cinderella wished to leave, and the king's son was anxious to go with her, but she escaped from him so quickly that he could not follow her. The king's son had, however, used a stratagem and had caused the whole staircase to be smeared with pitch. And there, when she ran down, had the maiden's left slipper remained sticking. The king's son picked it up, and it was small and dainty and all golden. Next morning, he went with it to the father and said to him, "No one shall be my wife but she whose foot this golden slipper fits." Then were the two sisters glad, for they had pretty feet. The eldest went with the shoe into her room and wanted to try it on, and her mother stood by. But she could not get her big toe into it, and the shoe was too small for her. Then her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut the toe off. When thou art queen, thou wilt have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut the toe off, forced the foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. Then he took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her. They were, however, obliged to pass the grave, and there, on the hazel tree, sat the 2 pigeons and cried, "Turn and peep, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe, it is too small for her, the true bride waits for you." Then he looked at her foot and saw how the blood was streaming from it. He turned his horse round and took the false bride home again, and said she was not the true one, and that the other sister was to put the shoe on. Then this one went into her chamber and got her toes safely into the shoe, but her heel was too large. So her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut a bit off thy heel. When thou art queen, thou wilt have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut a bit off her heel, forced her foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. He took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her. But when they passed by the hazel tree, 2 little pigeons sat on it and cried, "Turn and peep, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe, it is too small for her, the true bride waits for you." He looked down at her foot and saw how the blood was running out of her shoe, how it had stained her white stocking. Then he turned his horse and took the false bride home again. "This also is not the right one," said he. "Have you no other daughter?" "No," said the man. "There is still a little stunted kitchen wench, which my late wife left behind her, but she cannot possibly be the bride." The king's son said he was to send her up to him, but the mother answered, "Oh no, she is much too dirty, she cannot show herself." He absolutely insisted on it, and Cinderella had to be called. She first washed her hands and face clean, and then went and bowed down before the king's son, who gave her the golden shoe. Then she seated herself on a stool, drew her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, and put it into the slipper, which fitted like a glove. And when she rose up and the king's son looked at her face, he recognized the beautiful maiden who had danced with him, and cried, "That is the true bride." The stepmother and 2 sisters were terrified and became pale with rage. He, however, took Cinderella on his horse and rode away with her. As they passed by the hazel tree, the 2 white doves cried, "Turn and peep, turn and peep, no blood is in the shoe. The shoe is not too small for her, the true bride rides with you." And when they had cried that, the 2 came flying down and placed themselves on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right, the other on the left, and remained sitting there. When the wedding with the king's son had to be celebrated, the 2 false sisters came and wanted to get into favor with Cinderella and share her good fortune. When the betrothed couple went to church, the elder was at the right side and the younger at the left, and the pigeons pecked out one eye of each of them. Afterwards, as they came back, the elder was at the left and the younger at the right, and then the pigeons pecked out the other eye of each. And thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness as long as they lived. Snow White. It was the middle of winter, and the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, and a queen sat at her window, working, and her embroidery frame was of ebony. As she worked, gazing at times out on the snow, she pricked her finger, and there fell from it 3 drops of blood on the snow. and when she saw how bright and red it looked, she said to herself, "Oh, that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the embroidery frame." Not very long after, she had a daughter, with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and she was named Snow White. And when she was born, the queen died. After a year had gone by, the king took another wife, a beautiful woman, but proud and overbearing, and she could not bear to be surpassed in beauty by anyone. She had a magic looking glass, and she used to stand before it and look in it and say, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking glass would answer, "You are the fairest of them all." And she was contented, for she knew that the looking glass spoke the truth. Now, Snow White was growing prettier and prettier, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as day, far more so than the queen herself. So one day, when the queen went to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" it answered, "Queen, you are full fair, 'tis true, but Snow White fairer is than you." This gave the queen a great shock, and she became yellow and green with envy, and from that hour her heart turned against Snow White, and she hated her. And envy and pride, like ill weeds, grew in her heart higher every day, until she had no peace day or night. At last, she sent for a huntsman and said, "Take the child out into the woods, so that I may set eyes on her no more. You must put her to death, and bring me her heart for a token." The huntsman consented and led her away. But when he drew his cutlass to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and to say, "Oh, dear huntsman, do not take my life. I will go away into the wild wood and never come home again." And as she was so lovely, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Away with you then, poor child." For he thought the wild animals would be sure to devour her, and it was as if a stone had been rolled away from his heart when he spared to put her to death. Just at that moment, a young wild boar came running by, so he caught it and killed it, and taking out its heart, he brought it to the queen for a token, and it was salted and cooked, and the wicked woman ate it up, thinking that there was an end of Snow White. Now, when the poor child found herself quite alone in the wild woods, she felt full of terror, even of the very leaves on the trees, and she did not know what to do for fright. Then she began to run over the sharp stones and through the thorn bushes, and the wild beasts after her. But they did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would carry her, and when the evening drew near, she came to a little house, and she went inside to rest. Everything there was very small, but as pretty and clean as possible. There stood the little table, ready laid, and covered with a white cloth, and 7 little plates, and 7 knives and forks, and drinking cups. By the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Snow White, being very hungry and thirsty, ate from each plate a little porridge and bread, and drank out of each little cup a drop of wine, so as not to finish up one portion alone. After that, she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds, but it did not seem to suit her. One was too long, another too short. But at last, the 7th was quite right, and so she lay down upon it, committed herself to heaven, and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters of the house came home. They were 7 dwarfs, whose occupation was to dig underground among the mountains. When they had lighted their 7 candles, and it was quite light in the little house, they saw that someone must have been in, as everything was not in the same order in which they left it. The first said, "Who's been sitting in my little chair?" The second said, "Who's been eating from my little plate?" The third said, "Who's been taking my little loaf?" The fourth said, "Who's been tasting my porridge?" The fifth said, "Who's been using my little fork?" The sixth said, "Who's been cutting with my little knife?" The seventh said, "Who's been drinking from my little cup?" Then the first one, looking round, saw a hollow in his bed and cried, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the others came running and cried, "Someone has been on our beds too." But when the seventh looked at his bed, he saw little Snow White lying there asleep. Then he told the others, who came running up, crying out in their astonishment, and holding up their 7 little candles to throw a light upon Snow White. "Oh goodness! Oh gracious!" cried they. "What beautiful child is this?" And were so full of joy to see her that they did not wake her, but let her sleep on. And the 7th dwarf slept with his comrades, an hour at a time with each, until the night had passed. When it was morning, and Snow White awoke and saw the 7 dwarfs, she was very frightened. But they seemed quite friendly, and asked her what her name was, and she told them. And then they asked how she came to be in their house. And she related to them how her stepmother had wished her to be put to death, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run the whole day long, until at last she had found their little house. Then the dwarf said, "If you will keep our house for us, and cook and wash, and make the beds, and sew and knit, and keep everything tidy and clean, you may stay with us, and you shall lack nothing." "With all my heart," said Snow White. And so she stayed, and kept the house in good order. In the morning, the dwarfs went to the mountain to dig for gold. In the evening, they came home, and their supper had to be ready for them. All the day long, the maiden was left alone, and the good little dwarfs warned her, saying, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know you are here. Let no one into the house." Now the queen, having eaten Snow White's heart, as she supposed, felt quite sure that now she was the first and fairest. And so she came to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the glass answered, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair." Then she was very angry, for the glass always spoke the truth, and she knew that the huntsman must have deceived her, and that Snow White must still be living. And she thought and thought how she could manage to make an end for her, for as long as she was not the fairest in the land, envy left her no rest. At last, she thought of a plan. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one would have known her. In this disguise, she went across the 7 mountains, until she came to the house of the 7 little dwarfs, and she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell! Fine wares to sell!" Snow White peeped out of the window and cried, "Good day, good woman. What have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," answered she. "Laces of all colours." And she held up a piece that was woven of variegated silk. "I need not be afraid of letting in this good woman," thought Snow White, and she unbarred the door and bought the pretty lace. "What a figure you are, child," said the old woman. "Come and let me lace you properly for once." Snow White, suspecting nothing, stood up before her and let her lace her with the new lace. But the old woman laced so quick and tight that it took Snow White's breath away, and she fell down as dead. "Now you have done with being the fairest," said the old woman as she hastened away. Not long after that, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home and were terrified to see their dear Snow White lying on the ground without life or motion. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly she was laced, they cut the lace in 2. Then she began to draw breath, and little by little, she returned to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no other than the wicked queen. You must beware of letting anyone in when we are not here." And when the wicked woman got home, she went to her glass and said, "Looking glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And it answered as before, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard that, she was so struck with surprise that all the blood left her heart, for she knew that Snow White must still be living. "But now," said she, "I will think of something that will be her ruin." And by witchcraft, she made a poisoned comb. Then she dressed herself up to look like another different sort of old woman. So she went across the 7 mountains, and she came to the house of the 7 dwarfs and knocked at the door and cried, "Good wares to sell, good wares to sell." Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I must not let anybody in." "But you are not forbidden to look," said the old woman, taking out the poisoned comb and holding it up. It pleased the poor child so much that she was tempted to open the door, and when the bargain was made, the old woman said, "Now, for once, your hair shall be properly combed." Poor Snow White, thinking no harm, let the old woman do as she would. But no sooner was the comb put in her hair than the poison began to work, and the poor girl fell down senseless. "Now, you paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "this is the end of you," and went off. By good luck, it was now near evening, and the 7 little dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as dead, they thought directly that it was the stepmother's doing, and looked about, found the poisoned comb, and no sooner had they drawn it out of her hair than Snow White came to herself and related all that had passed. Then they warned her once more to be on her guard and never again to let anyone in at the door. And the queen went home and stood before the looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking-glass answered as before, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard the looking-glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with anger. "Snow White shall die," cried she, "though it should cost me my own life." And then she went to a secret, lonely chamber where no one was likely to come, and there she made a poisonous apple. It was beautiful to look upon, being white with red cheeks, so that anyone who should see it must long for it, but whoever ate even a little bit of it must die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and clothed herself like a peasant woman and went across the 7 mountains to where the 7 dwarfs lived. And when she knocked at the door, Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I dare not let anybody in. The 7 dwarfs told me not." "All right," answered the woman. "I can easily get rid of my apples elsewhere. There, I will give you 1. "No," answered Snow White. "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the woman. "Look here, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You shall have the red side, I will have the white one." For the apple was so cunningly made that all the poison was in the rosy half of it. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple, and as she saw the peasant woman eating a piece of it, she could no longer refrain, but stretched out her hand and took the poisoned half. But no sooner had she taken a morsel of it into her mouth than she fell to the earth as dead. And the queen, casting on her a terrible glance, laughed aloud and cried, "As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony. This time the dwarfs will not be able to bring you to life again." And when she went home and asked the looking-glass, "Looking glass against the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" At last it answered, "You are the fairest now of all." Then her envious heart had peace, as much as an envious heart can have. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying on the ground, and there came no breath out of her mouth, and she was dead. They lifted her up, sought if anything poisonous was to be found, cut her laces, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but all was of no avail. The poor child was dead, and remained dead. Then they laid her on a bed, and sat all 7 of them round it, and wept and lamented 3 whole days. And then they would have buried her, but that she looked still as if she were living, with her beautiful blooming cheeks. So they said, "We cannot hide her away in the black ground." And they had made a coffin of clear glass, so as to be looked into from all sides, and they laid her in it, and wrote in golden letters upon it her name, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they set the coffin out upon the mountain, and one of them always remained by it to watch. And the birds came too, and mourned for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and lastly a dove. Now for a long while Snow White lay in the coffin, and never changed, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that one day a king's son rode through the wood, and up to the dwarf's house, which was near it. He saw on the mountain the coffin, and beautiful Snow White within it, and he read what was written in gold letters upon it. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, and I will give you whatever you like to ask for it." But the dwarfs told him that they could not part with it for all the gold in the world. But he said, "I beseech you to give it me, for I cannot live without looking upon Snow White. If you consent, I will bring you to great honor and care for you as if you were my brethren." When he so spoke, the good little dwarfs had pity upon him and gave him the coffin. And the king's son called his servants and bid them carry it away on their shoulders. Now it happened that as they were going along, they stumbled over a bush, and with the shaking, the bit of poisoned apple flew out of her throat. It was not long before she opened her eyes, threw up the cover of the coffin, and sat up, alive and well. "Oh dear, where am I?" cried she. The king's son answered, full of joy, "You are near me." And, relating all that had happened, he said, "I would rather have you than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's castle, and you shall be my bride." And Snow White was kind and went with him, and their wedding was held with pomp and great splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast, and when she had dressed herself in beautiful clothes, she went to her looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" The looking-glass answered, "O Queen, although you are of beauty rare, the young bride is 1,000 times more fair." Then she railed and cursed and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. First, she thought she would not go to the wedding, but then she felt she should have no peace until she went and saw the bride. And when she saw her, she knew her for Snow White, and could not stir from the place for anger and terror. For iron slippers had already been put on the fire, and they were brought in with tongs and set before her, and the queen was forced to put them on and dance until she fell down dead. Catskin. There was once a king whose queen had hair of the purest gold and was so beautiful that her match was not to be met with on the whole face of the earth. But this beautiful queen fell ill, and when she felt that her end drew near, she called the king to her and said, "Promise me that you will never marry again unless you meet with a wife who is as beautiful as I am and who has golden hair like mine." Then, when the king in his grief promised all she asked, she shut her eyes and died. But the king was not to be comforted, and for a long time never thought of taking another wife. At last, however, his wise men said, "This will not do. The king must marry again that we may have a queen." So, messengers were sent far and wide to seek for a bride as beautiful as the late queen. But there was no princess in the world so beautiful, and if there had been, still there was not one to be found who had golden hair. So the messengers came home and had had all their trouble for nothing. Now, the king had a daughter who was just as beautiful as her mother and had the same golden hair. And when she was grown up, the king looked at her and saw that she was just like this late queen. Then he said to his courtiers, "May I not marry my daughter? She is the very image of my dead wife. Unless I have her, I shall not find any bride upon the whole earth, and you say there must be a queen." When the courtiers heard this, they were shocked and said, "Heaven forbid that a father should marry his daughter. Out of so great a sin no good can come." And his daughter was also shocked, but hoped the king would soon give up such thoughts. So she said to him, "Before I marry anyone, I must have 3 dresses. One must be of gold, like the sun. Another must be of shining silver, like the moon. And a third must be dazzling as the stars. Besides this, I want a mantle, of 1,000 different kinds of fur put together, to which every beast in the kingdom must give a part of his skin. And thus she thought he would think of the matter no more. But the king made the most skillful workman in his kingdom weave the 3 dresses, one golden like the sun, another silvery like the moon, and a third sparkling like the stars. And his hunters were told to hunt out all the beasts in his kingdom, and to take the finest fur out of their skins. And thus a mantle of 1,000 furs was made. When all were ready, the king sent them to her. But she got up in the night when all were asleep, and took 3 of her trinkets, a golden ring, a golden necklace, and a golden brooch, and packed the 3 dresses of the sun, the moon, and the stars up in a nutshell, and wrapped herself up in the mantle made of all sorts of fur, and besmeared her face and hands with soot. Then she threw herself upon heaven for help in her need, and went away, and journeyed on the whole night, till at last she came to a large wood. As she was very tired, she sat herself down in the hollow of a tree, and soon fell asleep. And there she slept on till it was midday. Now, as the king to whom the wood belonged was hunting in it, his dogs came to the tree, and began to snuff about, and run round and round, and bark. "Look sharp," said the king to the huntsman, "and see what sort of game lies there." And the huntsman went up to the tree, and when they came back again, said, "In the hollow tree there lies a most wonderful beast, such as we never saw before. Its skin seems to be of 1,000 kinds of fur, but there it lies fast asleep." "See," said the king, "if you can catch it alive, and we will take it with us." So the huntsman took it up, and the maiden awoke and was greatly frightened, and said, "I am a poor child that has neither father nor mother left. Have pity on me, and take me with you." Then they said, "Yes, Miss Catskin, you will do for the kitchen. You can sweep up the ashes and do things of that sort." So they put her into the coach and took her home to the king's palace. Then they showed her a little corner under the staircase where no light of day ever peeped in, and said, "Catskin, you may lie and sleep there." And she was sent into the kitchen and made to fetch wood and water, to blow the fire, pluck the poultry, pick the herbs, sift the ashes, and do all the dirty work. Thus Catskin lived for a long time very sorrowfully. "Ah, pretty princess," thought she, "what will now become of thee?" But it happened one day that a feast was to be held in the king's castle, so she said to the cook, "May I go up a little while and see what is going on? I will take care and stand behind the door." And the cook said, "Yes, you may go, but be back again in half an hour's time to rake out the ashes." Then she took her little lamp and went into her cabin and took off the fur skin and washed the soot from off her face and hands, so that her beauty shone forth like the sun from behind the clouds. She next opened her nutshell and brought out of it the dress that shone like the sun, and so went to the feast. Everyone made way for her, for nobody knew her, and they thought she could be no less than a king's daughter. But the king came up to her and held out his hand and danced with her, and he thought in his heart, "I never saw anyone half so beautiful." When the dance was at an end, she curtsied, and when the king looked round for her, she was gone. No one knew whither. The guards that stood at the castle gate were called in, but they had seen no one. The truth was that she had run into her little cabin, pulled off her dress, blackened her face and hands, put on the furskin cloak, and was Catskin again. When she went into the kitchen to her work and began to rake the ashes, the cook said, "Let that alone till the morning and heat the king's soup. I should like to run up now and give a peep, but take care you don't let a hair fall into it, or you will run a chance of never eating again." As soon as the cook went away, Catskin heated the king's soup and toasted a slice of bread first, as nicely as ever she could. And when it was ready, she went and looked in the cabin for her little golden ring and put it into the dish in which the soup was. When the dance was over, the king ordered his soup to be brought in, and it pleased him so well that he thought he had never tasted any so good before. At the bottom, he saw a gold ring lying, and as he could not make out how it had got there, he ordered the cook to be sent for. The cook was frightened when he heard the order and said to Catskin, "You must have let a hair fall into the soup. If it be so, you will have a good beating." Then he went before the king and asked him who had cooked the soup. "I did," answered the cook. But the king said, "That is not true. It was better done than you could do it." Then he answered, "To tell the truth, I did not cook it, but Catskin did." "Then let Catskin come up," said the king. And when she came, he said to her, "Who are you?" "I am a poor child," said she, "that has lost both father and mother." "How came you in my palace?" asked he. "I am good for nothing," said she, "but to be scullion girl and to have boots and shoes thrown at my head." "But how did you get the ring that was in the soup?" asked the king. Then she would not own that she knew anything about the ring, so the king sent her away again about her business. After a time, there was another feast, and Catskin asked the cook to let her go up and see it as before. "Yes," said he, "but come again in half an hour and cook the king the soup that he likes so much." Then she ran to her little cabin, washed herself quickly, and took her dress out, which was silvery as the moon, and put it on. And when she went in, looking like a king's daughter, the king went up to her and rejoiced at seeing her again. And when the dance began, he danced with her. After the dance was at an end, she managed to slip out, so slyly that the king did not see where she was gone. But she sprang into her little cabin and made herself into Catskin again, and went into the kitchen to cook the soup. Whilst the cook was above stairs, she got the golden necklace and dropped it into the soup. Then it was brought to the king, who ate it, and it pleased him as well as before. So he sent for the cook, who was again forced to tell him that Catskin had cooked it. Catskin was brought again before the king, but she still told him that she was only fit to have boots and shoes thrown at her head. But when the king had ordered a feast to be got ready for a third time, it happened just the same as before. "You must be a witch, Catskin," said the cook, "for you always put something into your soup so that it pleases the king better than mine." However, he let her go up as before. Then she put on her dress, which sparkled like the stars, and went into the ballroom in it. And the king danced with her again, and thought she had never looked so beautiful as she did then. So, whilst he was dancing with her, he put a gold ring on her finger without her seeing it, and ordered that the dance should be kept up a long time. When it was at an end, he would have held her fast by the hand, but she slipped away and sprang so quickly through the crowd that he lost sight of her, and she ran as fast as she could into her little cabin under the stairs. But this time she kept away too long and stayed beyond the half hour, so she had not time to take off her fine dress and threw her fur mantle over it, and in her haste did not blacken herself all over with soot, but left one of her fingers white. Then she ran into the kitchen and cooked the king's soup, and as soon as the cook was gone, she put the golden brooch into the dish. When the king got to the bottom, he ordered Catskin to be called once more, and soon saw the white finger and the ring that he had put on it whilst they were dancing. So he seized her hand and kept fast hold of it, and when she wanted to loose herself and spring away, the fur cloak fell off a little on one side, and the starry dress sparkled underneath it. Then he got hold of the fur and tore it off, and her golden hair and beautiful form were seen, and she could no longer hide herself. So she washed the soot and ashes from her face, and showed herself to be the most beautiful princess upon the face of the earth. But the king said, "You are my beloved bride, and we will never more be parted from each other." And the wedding feast was held, and a merry day it was, as ever was heard of or seen in that country, or indeed in any other. Rapunzel. There were once a man and a woman who had long in vain wished for a child. At length, the woman hoped that God was about to grant her desire. These people had a little window at the back of their house, from which a splendid garden could be seen, which was full of the most beautiful flowers and herbs. It was, however, surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared to go into it, because it belonged to an enchantress who had great power and was dreaded by all the world. One day, the woman was standing by this window and looking down into the garden when she saw a bed which was planted with the most beautiful Rapunzel plant, and it looked so fresh and green that she longed for it and had the greatest desire to eat some. This desire increased every day, and as she knew that she could not get any of it, she quite pined away and looked pale and miserable. Then her husband was alarmed and asked, "What aileth thee, dear wife?" "Ah," she replied, "if I can't get some of the Rapunzel which is in the garden behind our house to eat, I shall die." The man who loved her thought, "Sooner than let thy wife die, bring her some of the Rapunzel thyself, let it cost thee what it will." In the twilight of the evening, he clambered down over the wall into the garden of the enchantress, hastily clutched a handful of Rapunzel, and took it to his wife. She at once made herself a salad of it and ate it with much relish. She, however, liked it so much, so very much, that the next day she longed for it 3 times as much as before. If he was to have any rest, her husband must once more descend into the garden. In the gloom of evening, therefore, he let himself down again. But when he had clambered down the wall, he was terribly afraid, for he saw the enchantress standing before him. "How canst thou dare," said she with an angry look, "to descend into my garden and steal my Rapunzel like a thief? Thou shalt suffer for it." "Ah," answered he, "let mercy take the place of justice. I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your Rapunzel from the window and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not got some to eat." Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be softened and said to him, "If the case be as thou sayest, I will allow thee to take away with thee as much Rapunzel as thou wilt. Only I make one condition. Thou must give me the child which thy wife will bring into the world. It shall be well treated, and I will care for it like a mother." The man, in his terror, consented to everything, and when the woman was brought to bed, the enchantress appeared at once, gave the child the name of Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child beneath the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her into a tower which lay in a forest and had neither stairs nor door, but quite at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down thy hair to me." Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress, she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them round one of the hooks of the window above, and then the hair fell 20 ells down, and the enchantress climbed up by it. After a year or two, it came to pass that the king's son rode through the forest and went by the tower. Then he heard a song, which was so charming that he stood still and listened. This was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed her time in letting her sweet voice resound. The king's son wanted to climb up to her and looked for the door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once, when he was thus standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress came there, and he heard how she cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down thy hair." Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder by which one mounts, I will for once try my fortune," said he. And the next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down thy hair." Immediately, the hair fell down, and the king's son climbed up. At first, Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man such as her eyes had never yet beheld came to her. But the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been so stirred that it had let him have no rest, and he had been forced to see her. Then Rapunzel lost her fear, and when he asked her if she would take him for her husband, and she saw that he was young and handsome, she thought, "He will love me more than old Dame Gretel does." And she said yes, and laid her hand in his. She said, "I will willingly go away with thee, but I do not know how to get down. Bring with thee a skein of silk every time that thou comest, and I will weave a ladder with it, and when that is ready, I will descend, and thou wilt take me on thy horse." They agreed that until that time he should come to her every evening, for the old woman came by day. The enchantress remarked nothing of this, until once Rapunzel said to her, "Tell me, Dame Gretel, how it happens that you are so much heavier for me to draw up than the young king's son. He is with me in a moment." "Ah, thou wicked child!" cried the enchantress. "What do I hear thee say? I thought I had separated thee from all the world, and yet thou hast deceived me." In her anger, she clutched Rapunzel's beautiful tresses, wrapped them twice round her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with the right, and snip, snap, they were cut off, and the lovely braids lay on the ground, and she was so pitiless that she took poor Rapunzel into a desert where she had to live in great grief and misery. On the same day, however, that she cast out Rapunzel, the enchantress in the evening fastened the braids of hair which she had cut off to the hook of the window, and when the king's son came and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down thy hair," she let the hair down. The king's son ascended, but he did not find his dearest Rapunzel above, but the enchantress, who gazed at him with wicked and venomous looks. "Aha!" she cried mockingly. "Thou wouldst fetch thy dearest, but the beautiful bird sits no longer singing in the nest. The cat has got it, and will scratch out thy eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to thee. Thou wilt never see her more." The king's son was beside himself with pain, and in his despair he leapt down from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. Then he wandered quite blind about the forest, ate nothing but roots and berries, and did nothing but lament and weep over the loss of his dearest wife. Thus he roamed about in misery for some years, and at length came to the desert where Rapunzel, with the twins to which she had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness. He heard a voice, and it seemed so familiar to him that he went towards it. And when he approached, Rapunzel knew him and fell on his neck and wept. 2 of her tears wetted his eyes, and they grew clear again, and he could see with them as before. He led her to his kingdom, where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time afterwards, happy and contented. The Pied Piper of Hamelin. In the year 1284, a mysterious man appeared in Hamelin. He was wearing a coat of many-coloured, bright cloth, for which reason he was called the Pied Piper. He claimed to be a rat-catcher, and he promised that for a certain sum he would rid the city of all mice and rats. The citizens struck a deal, promising him a certain price. The rat-catcher then took a small fife from his pocket and began to blow on it. Rats and mice immediately came from every house and gathered around him. When he thought that he had them all, he led them to the river, where he pulled up his clothes and walked into the water. The animals all followed him, fell in, and drowned. Now that the citizens had been freed of their plague, they regretted having promised so much money, and, using all kinds of excuses, they refused to pay him. Finally, he went away, bitter and angry. He returned on June the 26th, St. John's and St. Paul's Day, early in the morning at 7 o'clock, now dressed in a hunter's costume, with a dreadful look on his face, and wearing a strange red hat. He sounded his fife in the streets, but this time it wasn't rats and mice that came to him, but rather children, a great number of boys and girls from their 4th year on. Among them was the mayor's grown daughter. The swarm followed him, and he led them into a mountain, where he disappeared with them. All this was seen by a babysitter, who, carrying a child in her arms, had followed them from a distance, but had then turned around and carried the news back to the town. The anxious parents ran in droves to the town gates, seeking their children. The mothers cried out and sobbed pitifully. Within the hour, messengers were sent everywhere by water and by land, inquiring if the children, any of them, had been seen. But it was all for naught. In total, 130 were lost. 2, as some say, had lagged behind and came back. One of them was blind, and the other mute. The blind one was not able to point out the place, but was able to tell how they had followed the piper. The mute one was able to point out the place, although he had heard nothing. One little boy in shirt sleeves had gone along with the others, but had turned back to fetch his jacket, and thus escaped the tragedy. For when he returned, the others had already disappeared into a cave within a hill. This cave is still there to this day. Until the middle of the 18th century, and probably still today, the street through which the children were led out to the town gate was called the drumless, soundless, quiet street, because no dancing or music was allowed there. Indeed, when a bridal procession on its way to church crossed this street, the musicians would have to stop playing. The mountain near Hamelin, where the children disappeared, is called Poppenberg. 2 stone monuments in the form of crosses have been erected there, one on the left side and one on the right. Some say that the children were led into a cave and that they came out again in Transylvania. The citizens of Hamelin recorded this event in their town register, and they came to date all their proclamations according to the years and days since the loss of their children. According to Seyfried, the 22nd, rather than the 26th of June, was entered into the town register. The following lines were inscribed on the town hall. In the year 1284, after the birth of Christ, from Hamelin were led away 130 children born at this place, led away by a piper into a mountain. And on the new gate was inscribed, Centum ter denos cum magus ab urbe puellos duxerat ante annos 272 condita porta fuit. This gate was built 272 years after the magician led the 130 children from the city. The Golden Goose. There was once a man who had 3 sons, the youngest of whom was called the Simpleton, and was despised, laughed at, and neglected on every occasion. It happened one day that the eldest son wished to go into the forest to cut wood, and before he went, his mother gave him a delicious pancake and a flask of wine, that he might not suffer from hunger or thirst. When he came into the forest, a little old grey man met him, who wished him good day and said, "Give me a bit of cake out of your pocket and let me have a drink of your wine. I'm so hungry and thirsty." But the prudent youth answered, "Give you my cake and my wine? I haven't got any. Be off with you." And leaving the little man standing there, he went off. Then he began to fell a tree, but he had not been at it long before he made a wrong stroke, and the hatchet hit him in the arm, so that he was obliged to go home and get it bound up. That was what came of the little grey man. Afterwards, the second son went into the wood, and the mother gave to him, as to the eldest, a pancake and a flask of wine. The little old grey man met him also, and begged for a little bit of cake and a drink of wine. But the second son spoke out plainly, saying, "What I give you I lose myself, so be off with you." And leaving the little man standing there, he went off. The punishment followed. As he was chopping away at the tree, he hit himself in the leg so severely that he had to be carried home. Then said the simpleton, "Father, let me go for once into the forest to cut wood." And the father answered, "Your brothers have hurt themselves by so doing. Give it up. You understand nothing about it." But the simpleton went on begging so long that the father said at last, "Well, be off with you. You will only learn by experience." The mother gave him a cake. It was only made with water and baked in the ashes, and with it a flask of sour beer. When he came into the forest, the little old grey man met him and greeted him, saying, "Give me a bit of your cake and a drink from your flask. I'm so hungry and thirsty." And the simpleton answered, "I have only a flour and water cake and sour beer. But if that is good enough for you, let us sit down together and eat." Then they sat down, and as the simpleton took out his flour and water cake, it became a rich pancake, and his sour beer became good wine. Then they ate and drank, and afterwards the little man said, "As you have such a kind heart and share what you have so willingly, I will bestow good luck upon you. Yonder stands an old tree. Cut it down, and at its roots you will find something." And thereupon the little man took his departure. The simpleton went there and hewed away at the tree, and when it fell, he saw sitting among the roots a goose with feathers of pure gold. He lifted it out and took it with him to an inn where he intended to stay the night. The landlord had 3 daughters who, when they saw the goose, were curious to know what wonderful kind of bird it was, and ended by longing for one of its golden feathers. The eldest thought, "I will wait for a good opportunity, and then I will pull out one of its feathers for myself." And so, when the simpleton was gone out, she seized the goose by its wing. But there her finger and hand had to stay, held fast. Soon after came the second sister, with the same idea of plucking out one of the golden feathers for herself. But scarcely had she touched her sister, than she also was obliged to stay, held fast. Lastly came the third, with the same intentions, but the others screamed out, "Stay away, for heaven's sake, stay away!" But she did not see why she should stay away, and thought, "If they do so, why should not I?" and went towards them. But when she reached her sisters there, she stopped, hanging on with them. And so they had to stay all night. The next morning, the simpleton took the goose under his arm and went away, unmindful of the 3 girls that hung on to it. The 3 had always to run after him, left and right, wherever his legs carried him. In the midst of the fields they met the parson, who, when he saw the procession, said, "Shame on you girls, running after a young fellow through the fields like this." And forthwith he seized hold of the youngest by the hand to drag her away. But hardly had he touched her, when he too was obliged to run after them himself. Not long after, the sexton came that way, and seeing the respected parson following at the heels of the 3 girls, he called out, "Ho, your reverence, whither away so quickly? You forget that we have another christening today." And he seized hold of him by his gown. But no sooner had he touched him than he was obliged to follow on too. As the 5 tramped on, one after another, 2 peasants with their hoes came up from the fields, and the parson cried out to them and begged them to come and set him and the sexton free. But no sooner had they touched the sexton than they had to follow on too, and now there were 7 following the simpleton and the goose. By and by, they came to a town where a king reigned who had an only daughter, who was so serious that no one could make her laugh. Therefore, the king had given out that whoever should make her laugh should have her in marriage. The simpleton, when he heard this, went with his goose and his hangers-on into the presence of the king's daughter. And as soon as she saw the 7 people following, always one after the other, she burst out laughing and seemed as if she could never stop. And so, the simpleton earned a right to her as his bride. But the king did not like him for a son-in-law and made all kinds of objections and said he must first bring a man who could drink up a whole cellar of wine. The simpleton thought that the little grey man would be able to help him and went out into the forest, and there, on the very spot where he felled the tree, he saw a man sitting with a very sad countenance. The simpleton asked him what was the matter, and he answered, "I have a great thirst, which I cannot quench. Cold water does not agree with me. I have indeed drunk up a whole cask of wine, but what good is a drop like that?" Then said the simpleton, "I can help you. Only come with me, and you shall have enough." He took him straight to the king's cellar, and the man sat himself down before the big vats and drank and drank, and before a day was over, he had drunk up the whole cellar full. The simpleton again asked for his bride, but the king was annoyed that a wretched fellow called the simpleton by everybody should carry off his daughter, and so he made new conditions. He was to produce a man who could eat up a mountain of bread. The simpleton did not hesitate long, but ran quickly off to the forest, and there, in the same place, sat a man who had fastened a strap round his body, making a very piteous face, and saying, "I have eaten a whole bakehouse full of rolls, but what is the use of that when one is so hungry as I am? My stomach feels quite empty, and I am obliged to strap myself together that I may not die of hunger." The simpleton was quite glad of this, and said, "Get up quickly and come along with me, and you shall have enough to eat." He led him straight to the king's courtyard, where all the meal in the kingdom had been collected and baked into a mountain of bread. The man out of the forest settled himself down before it and hastened to eat, and in one day the whole mountain had disappeared. Then the simpleton asked for his bride the 3rd time. The king, however, found one more excuse and said he must have a ship that should be able to sail on land or on water. "So soon," said he, "as you come sailing along with it, you shall have my daughter for your wife." The simpleton went straight to the forest, and there sat the little old grey man with whom he had shared his cake, and he said, "I have eaten for you, and I have drunk for you. I will also give you the ship, and all because you were kind to me at the first." Then he gave him the ship that could sail on land and on water, and when the king saw it, he knew he could no longer withhold his daughter. The marriage took place immediately, and at the death of the king, the simpleton possessed the kingdom and lived long and happily with his wife. The Sleeping Beauty. A long time ago, there were a king and queen who said every day, "Ah, if only we had a child." But they never had one. But it happened that once, when the Queen was bathing, a frog crept out of the water onto the land and said to her, "Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has gone by, you shall have a daughter." What the frog had said came true, and the Queen had a little girl who was so pretty that the king could not contain himself for joy and ordered a great feast. He invited not only his kindred, friends, and acquaintance, but also the wise women, in order that they might be kind and well disposed towards the child. There were 13 of them in his kingdom, but as he had only 12 golden plates for them to eat out of, one of them had to be left at home. The feast was held with all manner of splendor, and when it came to an end, the wise women bestowed their magic gifts upon the baby. One gave virtue, another beauty, a third riches, and so on, with everything in the world that one can wish for. When 11 of them had made their promises, suddenly the 13th came in. She wished to avenge herself for not having been invited, and without greeting or even looking at anyone, she cried with a loud voice, "The king's daughter shall in her 15th year prick herself with a spindle and fall down dead." And, without saying a word more, she turned round and left the room. They were all shocked, but the 12th, whose good wish still remained unspoken, came forward, and as she could not undo the evil sentence, but only soften it, she said, "It shall not be death, but a deep sleep of 100 years into which the princess shall fall." The king, who would fain keep his dear child from the misfortune, gave orders that every spindle in the whole kingdom should be burnt. Meanwhile, the gifts of the wise women were plenteously fulfilled on the young girl, for she was so beautiful, modest, good-natured, and wise that everyone who saw her was bound to love her. It happened that on the very day when she was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, and the maiden was left in the palace quite alone. So she went round into all sorts of places, looked into rooms and bedchambers just as she liked, and at last came to an old tower. She climbed up the narrow, winding staircase and reached a little door. A rusty key was in the lock, and when she turned it, the door sprang open, and there, in a little room, sat an old woman with a spindle, busily spinning her flax. "Good day, old dame," said the king's daughter. "What are you doing there?" "I am spinning," said the old woman, and nodded her head. "What sort of thing is that rattles round so merrily?" said the girl, and she took the spindle and wanted to spin too. But scarcely had she touched the spindle when the magic decree was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger with it. And, in the very moment when she felt the prick, she fell down upon the bed that stood there and lay in a deep sleep. And this sleep extended over the whole palace. The king and queen, who had just come home and had entered the great hall, began to go to sleep, and the whole of the court with them. The horses, too, went to sleep in the stable, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons upon the roof, the flies on the wall. Even the fire that was flaming on the hearth became quiet and slept. The roast meat left off frizzling, and the cook, who was just going to pull the hair of the scullery boy because he had forgotten something, let him go, and went to sleep. And the wind fell, and on the trees before the castle, not a leaf moved again. But round about the castle there began to grow a hedge of thorns, which every year became higher, and at last grew close up round the castle and all over it, so that there was nothing of it to be seen, not even the flag upon the roof. But the story of the beautiful sleeping Briar Rose, for so the princess was named, went about the country, so that from time to time kings' sons came and tried to get through the thorny hedge into the castle. But they found it impossible, for the thorns held fast together, as if they had hands, and the youths were caught in them, could not get loose again, and died a miserable death. After long, long years, a king's son came again to that country, and heard an old man talking about the thorn hedge, and that a castle was said to stand behind it, in which a wonderfully beautiful princess named Briar Rose had been asleep for 100 years, and that the king and queen and the whole court were asleep likewise. He had heard, too, from his grandfather that many kings' sons had already come, and had tried to get through the thorny hedge, but they had remained sticking fast in it, and had died a pitiful death. Then the youth said, "I am not afraid. I will go and see the beautiful Briar Rose." The good old man might dissuade him as he would, he did not listen to his words. But by this time the 100 years had just passed, and the day had come when Briar Rose was to awake again. When the king's son came near to the thorn hedge, it was nothing but large and beautiful flowers, which parted from each other of their own accord, and let him pass unhurt. Then they closed again behind him, like a hedge. In the castle yard he saw the horses and the spotted hounds lying asleep. On the roof sat the pigeons with their heads under their wings, and when he entered the house, the flies were asleep upon the wall. The cook in the kitchen was still holding out his hand to seize the boy, and the maid was sitting by the black hen which he was going to pluck. He went on farther, and in the great hall he saw the whole of the court lying asleep, and up by the throne lay the king and queen. Then he went on still farther, and all was so quiet that a breath could be heard. And at last he came to the tower and opened the door into the little room where Briar Rose was sleeping. There she lay, so beautiful that he could not turn his eyes away, and he stooped down and gave her a kiss. But as soon as he kissed her, Briar Rose opened her eyes and awoke, and looked at him quite sweetly. Then they went down together, and the king awoke, and the queen, and the whole court, and looked at each other in great astonishment. And the horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The hounds jumped and wagged their tails. The pigeons upon the roof pulled out their heads from under their wings, looked round, and flew into the open country. The flies on the wall crept again. The fire in the kitchen burned up and flickered and cooked the meat. The joint began to turn and frizzle again, and the cook gave the boy such a box on the ear that he screamed, and the maid plucked the fowl ready for the spit. And then the marriage of the king's son with Briar Rose was celebrated with all splendor, and they lived contented to the end of their days. Tom Thumb. There was once a poor peasant who sat in the evening by the hearth and poked the fire, and his wife sat and span. Then said he, "How sad it is that we have no children. With us all is so quiet, and in other houses it is noisy and lively." "Yes," replied the wife, and sighed. "Even if we had only one, and it were quite small and only as big as a thumb, I should be quite satisfied, and we would still love it with all our hearts." Now it so happened that the woman fell ill, and after 7 months gave birth to a child that was perfect in all its limbs, but no longer than a thumb. Then said they, "It is as we wished it to be, and it shall be our dear child." And because of its size, they called it Tom Thumb. They did not let it want for food, but the child did not grow taller, but remained as it had been at the first. Nevertheless, it looked sensibly out of its eyes, and soon showed itself to be a wise and nimble creature, for everything it did turned out well. One day, the peasant was getting ready to go into the forest to cut wood, when he said, as if to himself, "How I wish that there was anyone who would bring the cart to me." "Oh, father," cried Tom Thumb, "I will soon bring the cart, rely on that. It shall be in the forest at the appointed time." The man smiled and said, "How can that be done? Thou art far too small to lead the horse by the reins." "That's of no consequence, father. If my mother will only harness it, I shall sit in the horse's ear and call out to him how he is to go." "Well," answered the man, "for once we will try it." When the time came, the mother harnessed the horse and placed Thumbling in its ear, and then the little creature cried, "Gee up! Gee up!" Then it went quite properly, as if with its master, and the cart went the right way into the forest. It so happened that just as he was turning a corner and the little one was crying, "Gee up!" 2 strange men came towards him. "My word," said one of them. "What is this? There's a cart coming, and a driver is calling to the horse, and still he is not to be seen." "That can't be right," said the other. "We will follow the cart and see where it stops." The cart, however, drove right into the forest, and exactly to the place where the wood had been cut. When Tom Thumb saw his father, he cried to him, "Seest thou, father? Here I am with the cart. Now take me down." The father got hold of the horse with his left hand, and with the right took his little son out of the ear. Tom Thumb sat down quite merrily on a straw, but when the 2 strange men saw him, they did not know what to say for astonishment. Then one of them took the other aside and said, "Hark! The little fellow would make our fortune if we exhibited him in a large town for money. We will buy him." They went to the peasant and said, "Sell us the little man. He shall be well treated with us." "No," replied the father. "He is the apple of my eye, and all the money in the world cannot buy him from me." Tom Thumb, however, when he heard of the bargain, had crept up the folds of his father's coat, placed himself on his shoulder, and whispered in his ear, "Father, do give me away. I will soon come back again." Then the father parted with him to the 2 men for a handsome bit of money. "Where wilt thou sit?" they said to him. "Oh, just set me on the rim of your hat, and then I can walk backwards and forwards and look at the country, and still not fall down." They did as he wished, and when Tom Thumb had taken leave of his father, they went away with him. They walked until it was dusk, and then the little fellow said, "Do take me down. I want to come down." The man took his hat off and put the little fellow on the ground by the wayside, and he leapt and crept about a little between the sods. And then he suddenly slipped into a mouse hole which he had sought out. "Good evening, gentlemen. Just go home without me," he cried to them, and mocked them. They ran thither and stuck their sticks into the mouse hole, but it was all lost labour. Tom Thumb crept still farther in, and as it soon became quite dark, they were forced to go home with their vexation and their empty purses. When Tom Thumb saw that they were gone, he crept back out of the subterranean passage. "It is so dangerous to walk on the ground in the dark," said he. "How easily a neck or a leg is broken." Fortunately, he knocked against an empty snail shell. "Thank God," said he. "In that, I can pass the night in safety," and got into it. Not long afterwards, when he was just going to sleep, he heard two men go by, and one of them was saying, "How shall we contrive to get hold of the rich pastor's silver and gold?" "I could tell thee that," cried Tom Thumb, interrupting them. "What was that?" said one of the thieves in fright. "I heard someone speaking." They stood still, listening, and Tom Thumb spoke again and said, "Take me with you, and I'll help you." "But where art thou?" "Just look on the ground and observe from whence my voice comes," he replied. There the thieves at length found him and lifted him up. "Thou little imp, how wilt thou help us?" they said. "A great deal," said he. "I will creep into the pastor's room through the iron bars and will reach out to you whatever you want to have." "Come then," they said, "and we will see what thou canst do." When they got to the pastor's house, Tom Thumb crept into the room, but instantly cried out with all his might, "Do you want to have everything that is here?" The thieves were alarmed and said, "But do speak softly, so as not to waken anyone." Tom Thumb, however, behaved as if he had not understood this, and cried again, "What do you want? Do you want to have everything that is here?" The cook, who slept in the next room, heard this and sat up in bed and listened. The thieves, however, had in their fright run some distance away. But at last they took courage and thought, "The little rascal wants to mock us." They came back and whispered to him, "Come, be serious and reach something out to us." Then Tom Thumb again cried as loudly as he could, "I really will give you everything. Just put your hands in." The maid, who was listening, heard this quite distinctly and jumped out of bed and rushed to the door. The thieves took flight and ran as if the wild huntsmen were behind them. But as the maid could not see anything, she went to strike a light. When she came to the place with it, Tom Thumb, unperceived, betook himself to the granary, and the maid, after she had examined every corner and found nothing, lay down in her bed again and believed that, after all, she had only been dreaming with open eyes and ears. Tom Thumb had climbed up among the hay and found a beautiful place to sleep in. There he intended to rest until day, and then go home again to his parents. But he had other things to go through. Truly, there is much affliction and misery in this world. When day dawned, the maid arose from her bed to feed the cows. Her first walk was into the barn, where she laid hold of an armful of hay, and precisely that very one in which poor Tom Thumb was lying asleep. He, however, was sleeping so soundly that he was aware of nothing, and did not awake until he was in the mouth of the cow, who had picked him up with the hay. "Oh, heavens!" cried he. "How have I got into the fulling mill?" But he soon discovered where he was. Then it was necessary to be careful, not to let himself go between the teeth and be dismembered. But he was nevertheless forced to slip down into the stomach with the hay. "In this little room, the windows are forgotten," said he, "and no sun shines in, neither will a candle be brought." His quarters were especially unpleasing to him, and the worst was, more and more hay was always coming in by the door, and the space grew less and less. Then at length, in his anguish, he cried as loud as he could, "Bring me no more fodder! Bring me no more fodder!" The maid was just milking the cow, and when she heard someone speaking and saw no one, and perceived that it was the same voice that she had heard in the night, she was so terrified that she slipped off her stool and spilt the milk. She ran in great haste to her master and said, "Oh heavens, pastor, the cow has been speaking." "Thou art mad," replied the pastor. But he went himself to the byre to see what was there. Hardly, however, had he set his foot inside, when Tom Thumb again cried, "Bring me no more fodder! Bring me no more fodder!" Then the pastor himself was alarmed, and thought that an evil spirit had gone into the cow, and ordered her to be killed. She was killed, but the stomach, in which Tom Thumb was thrown on the midden. Tom Thumb had great difficulty in working his way. However, he succeeded so far as to get some room, but just as he was going to thrust his head out, a new misfortune occurred. A hungry wolf ran thither and swallowed the whole stomach at one gulp. Tom Thumb did not lose courage. "Perhaps," thought he, "the wolf will listen to what I've got to say." And he called to him from out of his stomach, "Dear wolf, I know of a magnificent feast for you."
"Where is it to be had?"
said the wolf. "In such and such a house. Thou must creep into it through the kitchen sink, and wilt find cakes and bacon and sausages, and as much of them as thou canst eat." And he described to him exactly his father's house. The wolf did not require to be told this twice, squeezed himself in at night through the sink, and ate to his heart's content in the larder. When he had eaten his fill, he wanted to go out again, but he had become so big that he could not go out by the same way. Tom Thumb had reckoned on this, and now began to make a violent noise in the wolf's body, and raged and screamed as loudly as he could.
"Wilt thou be quiet?"
said the wolf.
"Thou wilt waken up the people."
"Eh? What?" replied the little fellow. "Thou hast eaten thy fill, and I will make merry likewise," and began once more to scream with all his strength. At last, his father and mother were aroused by it, and ran to the room and looked in through the opening in the door. When they saw that a wolf was inside, they ran away, and the husband fetched his axe, and the wife the scythe. "Stay behind," said the man when they entered the room. "When I have given him a blow, if he is not killed by it, thou must cut him down and hew his body to pieces." Then Tom Thumb heard his parents' voices and cried, "Dear father, I'm here. I'm in the wolf's body." Said the father, full of joy, "Thank God, our dear child has found us again," and bade the woman take away her scythe, that Tom Thumb might not be hurt with it. After that, he raised his arm and struck the wolf such a blow on his head that he fell down dead. And then they got knives and scissors and cut his body open and drew the little fellow forth. "Ah," said the father, "what sorrow we have gone through for thy sake.
"Yes, father. I have gone about the world a great deal. Thank heaven I breathe fresh air again."
"Where hast thou been then?"
"Oh, father, I have been in a mouse's hole, in a cow's stomach, and then in a wolf's. Now I will stay with you."
"And we will not sell thee again. No, not for all the riches in the world," said his parents, and they embraced and kissed their dear Tom Thumb. And they gave him something to eat and drink, and had some new clothes made for him, for his own had been spoiled on his journey. The Frog Prince. In old times, when wishing still helped one, there lived a king whose daughters were all beautiful. But the youngest was so beautiful that the sun itself, which has seen so much, was astonished whenever it shone in her face. Close by the king's castle lay a great dark forest, and under an old lime tree in the forest was a well. And when the day was very warm, the king's child went out into the forest and sat down by the side of the cool fountain. And when she was dull, she took a golden ball and threw it up on high and caught it. And this ball was her favorite plaything. Now it so happened that on one occasion the princess's golden ball did not fall into the little hand which she was holding up for it, but onto the ground beyond, and rolled straight into the water. The king's daughter followed it with her eyes, but it vanished, and the well was deep, so deep that the bottom could not be seen. On this, she began to cry, and cried louder and louder, and could not be comforted. And as she thus lamented, someone said to her,
"What ails thee, king's daughter? Thou weepest so that even a stone would show pity."
She looked round to the side from whence the voice came, and saw a frog stretching forth its thick, ugly head from the water. "Ah, old water splasher, is it thou?" said she. "I am weeping for my golden ball, which has fallen into the well."
"Be quiet and do not weep," answered the frog. "I can help thee, but what wilt thou give me if I bring thy plaything up again?"
"Whatever thou wilt have, dear frog," said she. "My clothes, my pearls and jewels, and even the golden crown which I am wearing." The frog answered,
"I do not care for thy clothes, thy pearls and jewels, or thy golden crown. But if thou wilt love me, and let me be thy companion and playfellow, and sit by thee at thy little table, and eat off thy little golden plate, and drink out of thy little cup, and sleep in thy little bed. If thou wilt promise me this, I will go down below and bring thee thy golden ball up again."
"Oh, yes," said she. "I promise thee all thou wishest, if thou wilt but bring me my ball back again." She, however, thought, "How this silly frog does talk. He lives in the water with the other frogs and croaks, and can be no companion to any human being." But the frog, when he had received this promise, put his head into the water and sank down, and in a short while came swimming up again with the ball in his mouth and threw it on the grass. The king's daughter was delighted to see her pretty plaything once more, and picked it up and ran away with it.
"Wait, wait,"
said the frog.
"Take me with thee. I can't run as thou canst."
But what did it avail him to scream his croak, croak after her as loudly as he could? She did not listen to it, but ran home and soon forgot the poor frog, who was forced to go back into his well again. The next day, when she had seated herself at table with the king and all the courtiers, and was eating from her little golden plate, something came creeping, splish, splash, splish, splash, up the marble staircase, and when it had got to the top, it knocked at the door and cried, "Princess, youngest princess, open the door for me." She ran to see who was outside, but when she opened the door, there sat the frog in front of it. Then she slammed the door to in great haste, sat down to dinner again, and was quite frightened. The king saw plainly that her heart was beating violently, and said,
My child, what art thou so afraid of? Is there perchance a giant outside who wants to carry thee away?"
"Oh, no," replied she. "It is no giant, but a disgusting frog."
"What does a frog want with thee?"
"Ah, dear father, yesterday, as I was in the forest sitting by the well, playing, my golden ball fell into the water, and because I cried so, the frog brought it out again for me, and because he so insisted, I promised him he should be my companion. But I never thought he would be able to come out of his water, and now he is outside there and wants to come into me." In the meantime, it knocked a second time and cried, "Princess, youngest princess, open the door for me. Dost thou not know what thou saidst to me yesterday by the cool waters of the fountain? Princess, youngest princess, open the door for me." Then said the king,
"That which thou hast promised must thou perform. Go and let him in."
She went and opened the door, and the frog hopped in and followed her step by step to her chair. There he sat and cried, "Lift me up beside thee." She delayed until at last the king commanded her to do it. When the frog was once on the chair, he wanted to be on the table, and when he was on the table, he said, "Now, push thy little golden plate nearer to me, that we may eat together." She did this, but it was easy to see that she did not do it willingly. The frog enjoyed what he ate, but almost every mouthful she took choked her. At length he said, "I have eaten and am satisfied. Now I am tired. Carry me into thy little room and make thy little silken bed ready, and we will both lie down and go to sleep." The king's daughter began to cry, for she was afraid of the cold frog, which she did not like to touch, and which was now to sleep in her pretty, clean little bed. But the king grew angry and said,
"He who helped thee when thou wert in trouble ought not afterwards to be despised by thee."
So she took hold of the frog with 2 fingers, carried him upstairs, and put him in a corner. But when she was in bed, he crept to her and said, "I am tired. I want to sleep as well as thou. Lift me up, or I will tell thy father." Then she was terribly angry, and took him up and threw him with all her might against the wall. "Now thou wilt be quiet, odious frog," said she. But when he fell down, he was no frog, but a king's son, with beautiful, kind eyes. He, by her father's will, was now her dear companion and husband. Then he told her how he had been bewitched by a wicked witch, and how no one could have delivered him from the well but herself, and that tomorrow they would go together into his kingdom. Then they went to sleep, and next morning, when the sun awoke them, a carriage came driving up with 8 white horses, which had white ostrich feathers on their heads, and were harnessed with golden chains, and behind stood the young king's servant, Faithful Henry. Faithful Henry
had been so unhappy when his master was changed into a frog that he had caused 3 iron bands to be laid round his heart, lest it should burst with grief and sadness. The carriage was to conduct the young king into his kingdom. Faithful Henry helped them both in, and placed himself behind again, and was full of joy because of this deliverance. And when they had driven a part of the way, the king's son heard a cracking behind him, as if something had broken. So he turned round and cried, "Henry, the carriage is breaking." "No, master, it is not the carriage. It is a band from my heart, which was put there in my great pain when you were a frog and imprisoned in the well." Again, and once again, while they were on their way, something cracked, and each time the king's son thought the carriage was breaking. But it was only the bands which were springing from the heart of faithful Henry, because his master was set free and was happy. The Elves and the Shoemaker. Story the first. A shoemaker, by no fault of his own, had become so poor that at last he had nothing left but leather for 1 pair of shoes. So, in the evening, he cut out the shoes which he wished to begin to make the next morning, and as he had a good conscience, he lay down quietly in his bed, commended himself to God, and fell asleep. In the morning, after he had said his prayers and was just going to sit down to work, the 2 shoes stood quite finished on his table. He was astounded and knew not what to say to it. He took the shoes in his hands to observe them closer, and they were so neatly made that there was not one bad stitch in them, just as if they were intended as a masterpiece. Soon after, a buyer came in, and as the shoes pleased him so well, he paid more for them than was customary, and, with the money, the shoemaker was able to purchase leather for 2 pairs of shoes. He cut them out at night, and next morning was about to set to work with fresh courage. But he had no need to do so, for when he got up, they were already made, and buyers also were not wanting, who gave him money enough to buy leather for 4 pairs of shoes. The following morning, too, he found the 4 pairs made, and so it went on constantly. What he cut out in the evening was finished by the morning, so that he soon had his honest independence again, and at last became a wealthy man. Now it befell that one evening not long before Christmas, when the man had been cutting out, he said to his wife before going to bed, "What think you if we were to stay up tonight to see who it is that lends us this helping hand?" The woman liked the idea and lighted a candle, and then they hid themselves in a corner of the room behind some clothes which were hanging up there, and watched. When it was midnight, 2 pretty little naked men came, sat down by the shoemaker's table, took all the work which was cut out before them, and began to stitch and sew and hammer so skillfully and so quickly with their little fingers that the shoemaker could not turn away his eyes for astonishment. They did not stop until all was done and stood finished on the table, and they ran quickly away. Next morning, the woman said, "The little men have made us rich, and we really must show that we are grateful for it. They run about so and have nothing on, and must be cold. I'll tell thee what I'll do. I will make them little shirts and coats, and vests and trousers, and knit both of them a pair of stockings, and do thou, too, make them 2 little pairs of shoes." The man said,
I shall be very glad to do it."
And one night, when everything was ready, they laid their presents all together on the table instead of the cutout work, and then concealed themselves to see how the little men would behave. At midnight, they came bounding in and wanted to get to work at once. But as they did not find any leather cut out, but only the pretty little articles of clothing, they were at first astonished. And then they showed intense delight. They dressed themselves with the greatest rapidity, putting the pretty clothes on and singing, "Now we are boys so fine to see, why should we longer cobblers be?" Then they danced and skipped and leapt over chairs and benches. At last, they danced out of doors. From that time forth, they came no more. But as long as the shoemaker lived, all went well with him, and all his undertakings prospered. Story the second. There was once a poor servant girl who was industrious and cleanly and swept the house every day and emptied her sweepings on the great heap in front of the door. One morning, when she was just going back to her work, she found a letter on this heap, and as she could not read, she put her broom in the corner and took the letter to her master and mistress. And behold, it was an invitation from the Elves, who asked the girl to hold a child for them at its christening. The girl did not know what to do, but at length, after much persuasion, and as they told her that it was not right to refuse an invitation of this kind, she consented. Then 3 elves came and conducted her to a hollow mountain where the little folks lived. Everything there was small, but more elegant and beautiful than can be described. The baby's mother lay in a bed of black ebony ornamented with pearls. The coverlids were embroidered with gold, and the cradle was of ivory, the bath of gold. The girl stood as godmother, and then wanted to go home again. But the little elves urgently entreated her to stay 3 days with them. So she stayed, and passed the time in pleasure and gaiety, and the little folks did all they could to make her happy. At last, she set out on her way home. Then first they filled her pockets quite full of money, and after that they led her out of the mountain again. When she got home, she wanted to begin her work, and took the broom, which was still standing in the corner, in her hand and began to sweep. Then some strangers came out of the house, who asked her who she was and what business she had there. And she had not, as she thought, been 3 days with the little men in the mountains, but 7 years, and in the meantime, her former masters had died. Story the third. A certain mother's child had been taken away out of its cradle by the elves, and a changeling with a large head and staring eyes, which would do nothing but eat and drink, laid in its place. In her trouble, she went to her neighbor and asked her advice. The neighbor said that she was to carry the changeling into the kitchen, set it down on the hearth, light a fire, and boil some water in 2 eggshells, which would make the changeling laugh. And if he laughed, all would be over with him. The woman did everything that her neighbor bade her. When she put the eggshells with water on the fire, the imp said,
I am as old now as the western forest, but never yet have I seen anyone boil anything in an eggshell.
And he began to laugh at it. Whilst he was laughing, suddenly came a host of little elves, who brought the right child, set it down on the hearth, and took the changeling away with them. Rumpelstiltskin. Once, there was a miller who was poor, but who had a beautiful daughter. Now it happened that he had to go and speak to the king, and in order to make himself appear important, he said to him, "I have a daughter who can spin straw into gold." The king said to the miller,
"That is an art which pleases me well. If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her tomorrow to my palace, and I will try what she can do."
And when the girl was brought to him, he took her into a room which was quite full of straw, gave her a spinning wheel and a reel, and said,
"Now set to work, and if by tomorrow morning early you have not spun this straw into gold during the night, you must die."
Thereupon, he himself locked up the room and left her in it alone. So, there sat the poor miller's daughter, and for the life of her could not tell what to do. She had no idea how straw could be spun into gold, and she grew more and more miserable, until at last she began to weep. But all at once, the door opened, and in came a little man, and said,
"Good evening, Mistress Miller. Why are you crying so?"
"Alas," answered the girl, "I have to spin straw into gold, and I do not know how to do it."
"What will you give me," said the mannequin, "if I do it for you?"
"My necklace," said the girl. The little man took the necklace, seated himself in front of the wheel, and whir, 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 3 turns, and the reel was full. Then he put another on, and whir, 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 3 times round, and the second was full too. And so it went on until the morning, when all the straw was spun, and all the reels were full of gold. By daybreak, the king was already there, and when he saw the gold, he was astonished and delighted. But his heart became only more greedy. He had the miller's daughter taken into another room full of straw, which was much larger, and commanded her to spin that also in one night, if she valued her life. The girl knew not how to help herself, and was crying, when the door again opened, and the little man appeared and said,
"What will you give me if I spin that straw into gold for you?"
"The ring on my finger," answered the girl. The little man took the ring, again began to turn the wheel, and by morning had spun all the straw into glittering gold. The king rejoiced beyond measure at the sight, but still he had not gold enough, and he had the miller's daughter taken into a still larger room full of straw, and said,
"You must spin this too in the course of this night. But if you succeed, you shall be my wife." Even if she be a miller's daughter, thought he, I could not find a richer wife in the whole world.
When the girl was alone, the mannequin came again for the 3rd time and said,
"What will you give me if I spin the straw for you this time also?"
"I have nothing left that I could give," answered the girl.
"Then promise me, if you should become queen, your first child."
"Who knows whether that will ever happen?" thought the miller's daughter, and, not knowing how else to help herself in this strait, she promised the mannequin what he wanted, and for that he once more span the straw into gold. And when the king came in the morning and found all as he had wished, he took her in marriage, and the pretty miller's daughter became a queen. A year after, she had a beautiful child, and she never gave a thought to the mannequin. But suddenly, he came into her room and said,
"Now give me what you promised."
The queen was horror-struck and offered the mannequin all the riches of the kingdom if he would leave her the child. But the mannequin said,
"No, something that is living is dearer to me than all the treasures in the world."
Then the queen began to weep and cry, so that the mannequin pitied her.
"I will give you 3 days' time," said he. "If by that time you find out my name, then shall you keep your child."
So the queen thought the whole night of all the names that she had ever heard, and she sent a messenger over the country to inquire far and wide for any other names that there might be. When the mannequin came the next day, she began with Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, and said all the names she knew, one after another. But to every one, the little man said,
"That is not my name."
On the second day, she had inquiries made in the neighborhood as to the names of the people there, and she repeated to the mannequin the most uncommon and curious. "Perhaps your name is Short Ribs, or Sheepshanks, or Laceleg." But he always answered,
"That is not my name."
On the third day, the messenger came back again and said, "I have not been able to find a single new name. But as I came to a high mountain at the end of the forest where the fox and the hare bid each other good night, there I saw a little house, and before the house a fire was burning, and round about the fire quite a ridiculous little man was jumping. He hopped upon one leg and shouted, 'Today I bake, tomorrow brew, the next I'll have the young queen's child. Ha! Glad am I that no one knew that Rumpelstiltskin I am styled.'" You may think how glad the queen was when she heard the name, and when soon afterwards the little man came in and asked,
"Now, Mistress Queen, what is my name?"
At first she said, "Is your name Conrad?"
"No."
"Is your name Harry?"
"No."
"Perhaps your name is Rumpelstiltskin?"
"The devil has told you that! The devil has told you that!"
cried the little man, and in his anger he plunged his right foot so deep into the earth that his whole leg went in, and then, in rage, he pulled at his left leg so hard with both hands that he tore himself in two. Thank you for listening to a collection of fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm. If you have enjoyed this audiobook, please consider subscribing and leaving a like to help in the making of future audiobooks.